and the hard parts with due diligence is lack of information. Like, you don't just look online and be like, oh, here's all sales. Yes, you go on Core Logic and 90% of the time the price is right. But then sometimes, like a lot of the times for us, we buy a property and we actually get 100, 200 grand price reduction because we found something wrong with it. So getting confidence in those numbers. The other hard one is actually looking at like comparable rentals. So you can have a look on Core Logic and look at like a sales campaign. They might say, oh, we advertised this for lease for 50 grand a year and it was on there for 2 weeks. Does that mean it had a 2-week vacancy, or did they take a month to advertise it? Did they just get someone to say yes to the property and then it was another 2 months? And what were the incentives? So there's all of a sudden this grunt work you start doing of calling property managers, being like, what do you got on the books at the moment? How long was it tenanted for? What was the square meter rate? What were the incentives? So this is the thing. It's probably lack of information when doing due diligence, and knowing how to get the information is probably the hardest part.
Coming back a step, maybe. When you find, like, you say you found a property, and then do you go under letter of intent and then due diligence and then contract, or is it a different way? Because I thought it was like sign a contract, but it's not the end figure or deal, and then how does it work? It's
case by case. Like, it depends. Like, so yeah. Most of the time, I'm going to make up a number here. About 80% of the time, we just go under contract, subject to due diligence. Okay. Normally, if there's something holding it up, like a lease, say the purchase is based on getting a lease signed, you might sign a heads of agreement or something like that, which is kind of like, it's almost like an option where you're signing, you're kind of there. But normally, you're just signing the contract, subject to due diligence, subject to finance. If it's a complicated deal, you might have special conditions that base it. But most of the time, my job is to get it. If I think it's a good deal, get it locked in under contract as quick as I can, because I'm not risking anything. I can get my deposit back if we pull out, and then start the negotiations there. You find the seller and the agent are more susceptible to changes if they think it's going to go through. So, like, if we do all our due diligence and we just find like, oh, the mezzanine's not approved, we can kind of approve due diligence based on that. So we say, hey, look, we either want money off the price. So, like, I'm a structural engineer by trade, so I can actually look at stuff and go, oh, look, it looks like it's to code. Let's get 15, 20, 30 grand off the price, knowing it costs about 10 grand to get it approved. Or we can extend settlement and get them to approve it and remove the risk completely. Or we can crush the deal. And the seller's more likely to say yes to something like that, where you're like, hey, everything's great with the property, we're happy with it, we will proceed if you do this, rather than kind of like, oh, can we have a 3-month extension while we work this out? So yeah, you generally just like work through the criticals, and then some things you let go. Like, we've bought properties that don't have mezzanines approved, for instance, and we go into that knowing full well that there's a risk. One of the key risks while we're talking due diligence is it actually doesn't get approved. Most of the time it doesn't get approved is because of car spots, surprisingly. So it's not the actual structural build of it, because mezzanines aren't that hard to build. Like, there are a couple like UB beams and some columns and stuff like that. You can always replace a beam and kind of make it work. But what happens from the extra floor space, most of the councils and zoning, you need a certain amount of car spots per floor space. But in a body corporate complex, you can't just build more car spots. So it gets rejected on that. Then there's obviously issues with finance, because they're not taking into account unapproved mezzanine area as part of the square meter rent. So even though you're getting rent for it, they're not taking into account. So they actually shade the rent. So that might actually, the valuation might come in 20% short. So this is what we're talking about. There's all these layers of complexity where you can do it yourself, but unless you know how to fix the problem when you find it, it becomes very kind of complicated.